Well, folks, we're here with Al Guerriero again, and he's the publisher. He's the the author of From Fra Angelico to Frankie One Eye, and here it is right here. As the subtext would say, an examination of Italian American nicknames and identity in the 21st century. And Al, you pretty much put it out there that the nicknames. Maybe it's not an Italian invention per se, but just the Italians have just mastered it, used it, and it's just been the way it's been for centuries,
And it's followed the culture. I mean, we're going to talk about it in a few minutes, but there's a real connection here. And I think that's what I want to convey to your audience today.
Well, you've written for us also in the magazine in Primo, just about some of the Renaissance nicknames.
Yes.
And, we talked about that last go round with ancient Rome, even had nicknames. Caesar was a nickname.
Yes.
And, the Renaissance painters were most of them are nicknames. And it's interesting how so many people look down on nicknames, but yet when they go to the museums to look at the Renaissance painters, they're actually Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, everybody. You're almost looking at the name is really a nickname of the painter, of what you're seeing.
Well, I don't know if they look down at nicknames. I just think that they don't understand the value of nicknames and how much of a prominent feature it is in language, in all languages, not only in Italian. This is going back ancient Rome, and to basically kind of add on to what you just said, the idea or the subject of nicknames really is something that has followed Italians and Italian Americans for centuries. I mean, you go back ancient Rome, right? As I mentioned in part one, ancient Rome, you had Cicero. That's a nickname. People don't realize that the great political statesman, that was a nickname. And also the emperors. You have Emperor Caligula, meaning little boots, because he wore those boots when he was younger, and he was being basically groomed as the emperor. Caracalla is he wore a cloak on his shoulders, which was kind of like if you were part of that high echelon, you would wear something like a caracalla, also meaning a cloak. So the idea of nicknames has always followed Italians for centuries. And then you go, as you just mentioned, you go and you talk about the famous Italian Renaissance painters, like Ghirlandaio, who was garland maker, and Fra Angelico, as you just mentioned, with the title of the book, which is right here. It's been great. The sales have been wonderful. And then I was talking to a friend the other day, and he mentioned he loved the nickname, which is a famous painter as well, Bronzino. And I don't mean the fish, right? I mean, this individual had darker skin, and that's one of the ways you would be given a nickname. Your physical characteristics, your personality traits, your locality where you live, that was another way. Your father's trade, your profession, that was another way of being given a nickname. So, for so long, the connection of Italian American nicknames is very apparent. And it's funny, because I wanted to talk to you about this as we corresponded the last few weeks. I wanted to talk because somebody could say, all right, so this book was published in October of 2021, and now we're soon to be 2024. And so, it's a little bit outdated. And I would say, no, let's stop for a second before you kind of come to that conclusion, because here's what I'd like to share. I don't know if you're a football fan, if you're following. Okay, great. So you're probably what is it? You can't say the Redskins anymore. So
no, we used to be we're now we're the Commanders, but I grew up in New Jersey, so I'm a Giants fan, and so I know where you're coming from.
All right, so then you know this story. I just want to give some context to your audience. Tommy DeVito, right? Tommy DeVito, a third string quarterback, and usually the third string quarterback, you never know their name, right? third string quarterback, great Cinderella story, Jersey kid, still lives home with his parents, and he's proud of it. He's proud of his Italian American heritage. And then suddenly the starting quarterback of the New York Giants gets hurt. He's out for the year. And then you have the backup, who then eventually gets hurt as well. And then Tommy DeVito comes in. And, people don't have really high expectations. He was a walk-on. They don't really have high expectations in terms of what he is going to be able to achieve. Miraculously, in a typical Cinderella story, and we love these underdog stories, right?
Right, sure.
It reminds me a little bit of Rocky.
Yeah.
It does, right? Anyway, so he is successful, at least for a few games. And he does not hide the fact that he loves, one of the things that he mentions in terms of his background is he loves his mother's chicken cutlets. And of course, what Italian boy is not going to mention something that his mother does or cooks so well? And we all have that. I think that's only in the Italian American community that we can really appreciate the food that our mother makes. I know personally, my mom made great eggplant parmesan. It was excellent. I loved it. But anyway, in this case, he mentions about the chicken cutlets, and I guess one of his teammates or several of his teammates got wind of it, and then next thing you know, and this is the point of how it's relevant, how my book is relevant today, right now in 2024, is that one of his teammates, I think it was Saquon Barkley, the running back, he mentions the fact that they won the game, and he had a really good passing percentage, etc. And so he says, "Yeah, look at Tommy Cutlets." So it gives him that nickname of Tommy Cutlets, and then the media takes that, right? And then before you know it, this now Cinderella story, he's filed a copyright. He's filed a copyright for Tommy Cutlets, and I think also it's Passing Paisano, which I'm not really, it's not catchy, but Tommy Cutlets is truly a catchy nickname, right? And now I think he has signed a contract with some tomato sauce company.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Probably not, right?
Right.
Because when you think of Italian American identity, you think of food, you think of family, and you think of faith. And I'm asking everyone to think about nicknames now. And here's a perfect example: Tommy Cutlets. Right? I mean, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Well, when you were growing up, did you have a nickname?
Yes. So so here's an interesting thing, and this gives a little bit of a background. Obviously, I was born in New York City, so I consider myself Italian American. But I also was connected to my roots in Italy. My father was an immigrant from Italy, and so I had actually several nicknames. So first off, I am Alfonso Jr., which is very unusual because in Italy, Junior is really frowned upon. It's not really encouraged for families to name their sons by the father's name. It's encouraged to name by the, say, grandfather's name or the your mother's father's name, but not your actual father's name. So that's something that my father decided to go away from. So I was called Junior many times. But then I also did not like my first name, Alfonso. I didn't like it growing up. It just was not mispronounced. It just didn't sound like John, Peter, or George Washington. That waspy kind of name, if you will, English, if you will, name. And I remember one time where a friend of mine, I think I was in fourth grade, and I heard Al, and he tapped me on the shoulder because I didn't respond to Al at the time. And I looked over and he was like, Al. And then he was referring to me. And I said, oh, that's good. I like that. It's one syllable. It's like under the radar, if you will. And then I kind of said, everybody, oh, why don't you just call me Al? Famous Paul Simon song
Right.
as well.
Right.
Um, so I was referred to as Al. But then when I went to Italy, in Italy, Alfonso is, you could say, Funzi. That's one way of kind of abbreviating the first name. You could say Afo. My family, my father's family is from the Campania region and near Naples. It's Provincia di Avellino. He's from a town called Mugnano del Cardinale. And so there's a few nicknames there. You can say Funzi, you can say Afo, you can say Fo. So I kind of grew up with this idea of nicknames. It was very, very prominent in my family, but also I began to see the patterns and connections that nicknames have in Italian culture. And so I just became fascinated, and then I hooked up with a linguistic society. And by the way, I just want to make sure that we understand each other. I'm not a linguist. I don't pretend to be a linguist. I'm not an expert in languages, but I am one of those individuals that I have a passion for language, and I'm somewhat fluent in the Neapolitan language, in Italian, somewhat in Spanish as well. So, I do feel that I have a trained ear, so to speak, to pick up on languages. And it just became something fascinating. But here's the thing, getting back to the Tommy DeVito story, I think that the media, who also influences the idea of nicknames, right? You have many, many media coin nicknames that they perpetuate within the written language. And I would say, and I mentioned this in the book, that to me is the Puzo Pileggi effect. And what I mean by that is that Mario Puzo, the writer of The Godfather, and Nicholas Pileggi, the writer of Wise Guy, who eventually wrote the screenplay for Goodfella and Casino and all those great mob movies, um, they, to me, revolutionized the American journalism.
Really?
And
Okay.
here's a perfect example, right? And this has just happened 2 weeks ago. So Tommy DeVito's not having a good game against the New Orleans Saints, and he's sacked. And I'm walking in the streets of New York City, and we still have, thankfully,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
we still have these newspaper stands occasionally, not as much as when I was growing up, when we were growing up, but they're still around. And I look over my shoulder and I see Tommy DeVito is flat on his back and he was sacked, right? But here's the point of the story and how it relates to the book. But instead, the Daily News, which is a New York tabloid periodical, instead of having sacked as the headline, they write whacked. He was whacked. And so again, I think that, and I just want your listeners to understand that there are these undertones of Italian American connection. And we could get into the stereotype later on, which is obviously very clear, but it's because of Mario Puzo and Nicholas Pileggi, who, by the way, I interviewed for the book and was very kind to include a blurb, book appraisal within the book itself as well. I would say these two individuals really revolutionize American journalism in the sense that the idea of Italian or mob lingo, if you will,
Yeah.
right, that really connects to this idea. And then it leads into the Italo-centric words, for example, like Godfather, Omertà, Consigliere, Made Member, Wise Guy, and I say that because occasionally I'll listen to Fox or I'll listen to CNN, And these political pundits will use references of The Godfather, and or Donnie Brasco. There's a good story that with Donnie Brasco. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but
I was with Johnny Depp and Al Pacino. Right,
yes,
was in the movie.
yes.
Right, yeah.
And so there's this great dialogue between the two where Lefty Guns Ruggiero, which is the Al Pacino character that he's portraying in the movie, he's basically trying to sell this diamond. And Donnie Brasco, Johnny Depp's character, who is really the FBI agent,
Right.
Joseph Stone, he is trying to basically listen to what he's saying. He's like, oh, this is a diamond. I need some money.
Right.
You get contact and you sell this. And so he looks at the diamond, the Johnny Depp character, Donnie Brasco, and he's like looking at it and he's observing it and he's like, nope, this is a fugazi. And then the Al Pacino character is like, what does that mean, a fugazi? What are you talking about? And he's like, it's a fake, And I say that because, I mean, it's become a popular term.
Yeah, sure.
Here of fugazi. I know that there was a song by Maroon 5.
Right.
Cardi B mentions the word fugazi.
Right.
So my point is that as Italian Americans are now emigrating from Italy and arriving to America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, it follows them, this subject of nicknames, and then eventually, you get into that stereotypical kind of jargon, if you will, or what sometimes is referred to, linguists will refer to it as neologisms, right? Where there are these new epithets or new words that are created by the newspaper editors to sell newspapers, but also to get a little bit of a chuckle from the readers.
Yeah. Well, you got the New York Daily News and the New York Post, and you mentioned about
polar opposites, by the way, polar opposites.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
One is very right and one is very left.
Right. And
but what's interesting is they'll use the same type of Italian-centric words for their headlines. Right. So they'll use things like whacked, or instead of saying Godfather, they there was a famous mobster in New York City in Greenwich Village called Vincent the Chin Gigante, and they would call him the Odd Father, and that
because he used to walk on the streets with his bathrobe on, correct, pretending that he was insane or talking to himself. And you'd see him in Greenwich Village actually walking in the early 80s. He would be walking in this bathrobe or whatever it is. But he didn't live. I don't think he lived there. I think he lived in Midtown Manhattan or something like that.
So, my mother's family is from that area, and yes and no. He actually did live on Sullivan Street with his mother, because that was part of the ruse that he was trying to portray in his narrative, let's say.
Right.
And he had a mistress that lived in Midtown.
Okay.
And he would go there to the mistress house later on, while he still had his family in New Jersey. So he had this triangle, if you will, life. But I did see him one time. I saw him. I was with a good friend of mine. And at the time, my father had a Reliant K car, the Chrysler. I don't know if you remember the Chrysler.
Yeah, that was like their first car that came after they reorganized for bankruptcy or something like that. They were going to try to make a comeback with the K car.
Italian American, a proud Italian American. Yeah. And anyway, we were waiting to pick up another friend, and I happened to be on Sullivan Street, and we were waiting for him, and sure enough, I see Chin walking in his bathrobe with a bodyguard. And I was frozen in time. My friend was like, oh my God, what is, and a car it was a navy blue Chrysler K car. And I don't know, it looked like a detective car, an undercover detective car. And by no means do we want to get any association with that at all. And I remember him looking right through the windshield, and I was just racing for the inevitable, which luckily didn't happen.
Well, they called him Vincent the Chin Chingati. Was that because, I guess, the name, or that it was once a boxer at one point in time, wasn't he? So,
Yes. Yes. So the way I remember the story is that his mother would call him Vincenzo, and his friends in the neighborhood understood that as Chin Encino or Chin, so they shortened it. And that's really how he gets his name. It's not because he had his chin, he was a boxer and he had a chin that was able to endure the punches. No, it really stemmed from his childhood and his friends at that time in Greenwich Village growing up, that they give him the nickname. And that's something that also we're doing in the Primo magazine, we're doing the Yogi Berra article.
right,
It's a perfect example where, and it's actually leading to 2 points. So Yogi Berra's mother, actually, and I don't know if how many people realize this. I just went to the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center in Little Falls, New Jersey. It's part of the story too that I was trying to pitch to you, and I'm thankful that you accepted. His mother called him Lodi, and the reason being is because she couldn't pronounce Lawrence. His real name was Lawrence Peter Berra, right? Okay. And so she would call him Lodi because she couldn't pronounce Larry or Lawrence, right? So she gave him the nickname Lodi. However, and this is what I find interesting, and this is the second part to this idea of nicknames, right? There are individuals that their nicknames really become their identity and not their official birth names, which I find fascinating. That's one part of this topic that I really, really am interested in. Anyway, so I think he was playing in the Sandlot Leads of St. Louis, where he had a teammate who had recently seen a movie about a yogi, and he made the connection that his teammate would sit down, would cross his legs and his arms similar to a yogi. And so he gave the name Yogi to Yogi Berra. And so from then on, he's known as Yogi. I mean, I recently listened to an interview with his granddaughter, Lindsay Berra, and she refers to him as Grandpa Yogi. So the idea of Lawrence, it's done, it's gone. And that's the beauty, I think, to your earlier point of, the fact that sometimes we don't really appreciate the nicknames. No, I'm trying to make people understand the value that nicknames have in languages. And then to the other point is that there's so many examples that, one could kind of think about in relation to the idea of how your nickname really then becomes part of your identity. Another example is in the book, I interviewed Ray Boom Boom Mancini, the boxer.
Sure.
I interviewed him and I asked him about this. There was 2 things that I asked him. First thing is he even told me, he said, growing up, and he's from Youngstown, Ohio, and he still lives within that area now. And he said, there are people that know me since childhood, but I don't think they know my official name, Ray. They just call me Boom Boom. And I was just, we both started laughing. And then the other thing that I found interesting with his story that I interviewed for the book was the fact that how many athletes, father and son athletes, and there's many that you could kind of come up with, but how many father and son athletes have the same nickname? Ray Mancini Sr., who was a very prominent fighter in the 1930s and 40s, he was given a nickname Boom Boom Mancini. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then later on, when Ray Jr. becomes a real, serious welterweight boxer, he then takes on the nickname of the father. And it's very rare. And I remember, talking to him about this, and he was a little bit puzzled. And then he was like, yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I'm like, well, that's why I love doing this research, because you can see the patterns and you can create, other hypotheses, if you will, and and just, have fun with it. And that's
Yeah.
really the point.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Well, I was watching a show about the NFL, and it was like the top 10 nicknames. And all these are all the men that were being interviewed were saying they lamented the fact that we don't have as many nicknames in football like we used to. Figure like Kenny the Snake Stabler, right? He was a famous football player. It comes to mind, and but it just goes to the point that it's a way to identify people, but it's also a way to have fun with people. It's a way to just enjoy what we're doing by giving people their nicknames and stuff.
To that point, before you go on, yeah, I'm a big New York Jets fan. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I
right,
like
sure.
the Giants. I root for the Giants, but I'm a diehard Jets fan, and unfortunately, I don't even want to go in that direction. But we have a cornerback by the name of Sauce Gardner, and I think from what I remember hearing is that he got the nickname. His grandmother gave him the nickname because he likes the hot sauce, and she would give him the hot sauce as a kid. But my point is that I recently saw a shirt, and this is the Italian connection here. I recently saw a shirt that said Sunday Sauce. It was a New York Jets shirt, but it said Sunday Sauce. And I said, there it is. That's a great shirt. It's the Italian American. Myself, I try to make the Sunday sauce as well, the way my mom made it, the way my grandmother made it. You know what I mean? And
that's great. Yeah.
I don't even know that. I don't even remember his name. I can't even tell you what his first name is. I just know him as Sauce Gardner.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's similar to you had Babe Ruth, and they used to call him the Bambino, right? So that was a way to connect to the Italians who were in New York at the time. Of course, they were Yankee fans like yourself. You're a Yankees fan, right?
Yes.
And that's it's a way to connect them to these various ethnic groups to increase their popularity.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of fun with it. But also I think, just getting back or linking it back to the idea of the media, there's a downside, right? And the downside is just getting back to my example early on about the Tommy DeVito, the New York Giants quarterback, when he was sacked, but on the Daily News, it read whacked. And, it kind of brings up some sensitive moments for the Italian American community, right? And I was reading on the online Primo. I think it was Professor Benetti,
right,
who wrote an article in regards to Tommy DeVito's agent,
right?
And I don't know how much of it was his agent also kind of putting himself into that stereotypical. I mean, the way he was dressed was a particular way with the fedora and
right.
However, I do think in the article it was presenting an interesting point in the sense that the Manning brothers, Eli and Peyton Manning, I didn't witness it, but I heard that Eli and Peyton Manning were making reference to a stereotypical, the way he was dressed, and then I believe they were saying something to the effect of gabagool, and that's very distasteful, if you will, very disparaging type of way. And unfortunately, within the Italian American community, there really isn't a lot of voice. I mean, we're integrated now, much so more than we were in the early 20th century, when we weren't referred to as even being white, if you will. We've certainly evolved, right? But our voice is not heard. And I think that, the Italian Defamation League and all these other leagues, organizations that are supposed to come to the defense of the Italian Americans, they weren't around for whatever reason. And obviously that should have been headlines, but it wasn't.
Right. The agent was Sean Stellato, and he was there Monday Night Football because I think it was the third game that Tommy DeVito won, I think. So he became the new talk of town. And he was there on the sidelines. He was on a cell phone. And like I said, he was wearing a fedora hat. It was very stylish. And he just looked like, they just ran with the stereotypes of the sports agent who was kind of, the talkative sports agent. Maybe he's connected to the mafia, or and this sort of thing. And this is what happened. And my point about that was when we looked at the article, when we looked at the idea of the article was if Stellato was there on the sideline and he didn't have a fedora hat on, but he had a cowboy hat on, would there even be this would there even be this controversy? But because he had a fedora hat, by the way, it's very stylish. It's out of fashion, of course, but nevertheless, he looked good. You know, he was clean cut, whatever. But that is what drove the stereotype, and it had a bad effect on him because he was the full agent, I think, of DeVito. And then DeVito, because there was a lot of, at first they were making fun of him. Then they started hating on him, basically, at some of these sports radio shows. And it got to the point where, DeVito fired him for his marketing part of his agency. He was not going to represent him just to do the contract negotiations, basically, but the marketing part of it, which is a lot of, which as you know, is big money. That was hired out to somebody else who was not Italian. So this is kind of the effect of it all. You know, they're able to take a stereotype, make fun of it, and then you go from the teasing part of it or whatever to then they start the hatred part of it. You know, the animosity, and this is what happens. Yeah, and no one really speaks out on it. You're right.
But I think that's part of the influence. And I go back to the Puzo Pileggi effect. And I don't mean to like hate on them or anything like that, but I just think that unbeknownst to them that this is now evolved into this idea. So you have the headlines that will say whacked or sob fella, right? Or odd father. You know, and so it allows that type of language to exist, but we need to understand and trace, look at the pattern and trace where the roots actually come from, because that's really where my research comes in, right? I want to really notice not just the headline itself that makes people laugh or those witty headlines, if you will, that's a wordplay. But I want to understand where did that actually evolve from? And I feel like in my book, I've traced the origins of where it really stems from. You know, when you use words like fugazi or forget about, you know, that's another one, right? Forget about it. And you hear that. I'll give you another case in point, how I feel that these political pundits who are very prominent on TV and social media, they will constantly make reference to the Godfather lines or the Goodfellow lines. And a perfect example is, I was watching recently, I was watching The Big Bang Theory, which is a very popular sitcom. And one of the characters uses the term, maybe he is sleeping with the fishes, right? And where would we hear that? And another point to this story is my family and I, we were invited to a Friendsgiving, and our friend had invited her family, and I happened to be sitting at the table where all the desserts were, and there was a line of cannoli, and her nephew, who's like 13, 14 years old, comes and gets a cannoli, and he says to himself, but I think it was also whoever was around him within earshot of him, he says, leave the gun and take the cannoli. And I stopped for a second. I said, whoa, wait a second. Can I ask you, where did you learn that? And he says, I just saw The Godfather with my father. And I thought to myself, wow, how we're passing on from generation to a younger now generation, this classical movie, if you will, and how we all, whether it's the political pundits, whether it's a 13, 14-year-old boy, it's how we make reference to movies like The Godfather, Goodfellow, Donnie Brasco, and how it's seeped into American culture. And that, to me, it's got the pros and cons. The pros being is that's part of a Italian-American legacy. And there's a really interesting part that I like, but also conversely, as you just mentioned earlier, there is that stereotype that kind of like leaves a sour taste in your mouth as well. And so that's where it becomes like, I don't know. They both kind of intertwine in a way where I both appreciate it, but I don't like it at the same time. And then I have this conflict from within, you know?
That's the dividing line, I think, in the Italian American community, because one side probably wants to be more stoic about it, and the other side, wants to express dismay about it, and anger about it, and seek change. And so, this is where, when we published that article, it's funny. We had people who wrote me and say, "Hey, why do we got to get upset about this? Why don't we just, not talk about it? Just, too many people are complaining about things nowadays." And you can understand that point, of course. But then the other group will say, like, "This is outrageous. We need to speak up about this." So I think that's where the division is in the Italian American community.
Well, I mean, look, I would argue that it does tarnish the ethnicity, and it's constant. This is something that we have struggled from the beginning of the 20th century. We've constantly struggled with this. And I also would cast some blame on the media. Look, we all like the mob movies. The Godfather is an American classic. I would say it's almost runs parallel to Gone with the Wind, and that famous line, "Frankly, I don't give a damn," right? That everybody would quote. But now it's kind of like crossed over where there's many references to the Godfather lines and the Donnie Brasco lines. But here's the point. I mean, I think that we also have to mention to the fact that nicknames is part of organized crime. It is part of gang culture, and the media has kind of taken these nicknames, if you will. Like, I mean, I guess the most famous one is Scarface Capone, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Take many of these nicknames, and it's to sell newspapers. Ultimately, it kind of like makes people kind of chuckle a bit, and sell newspapers that eventually are going to make money. And
Right.
This is the point. I know growing up for me in the 1980s, John Gotti was a big, I think he sold a lot of newspapers.
He was always on the front pages of the New York Post or the New York
Always.
Always.
And then the media coined nicknames, what? The Teflon Don, the Dapper Don, right? And appropriately named because he wore these, tailor-made suits, but it also fit their narrative, right? But also in the bigger picture, it cast an element of disdain for the Italian American community. And I remember growing up where, unfortunately, there were people that had a level of like, I don't know why, it was kind of like weird how there was a level of like pride in this situation, if you will.
Right.
But at the same time, I also felt that the media was contributing to this idea because they also love these nicknames, right? I mean, let's be honest. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, who was in the front cover of People magazine.
Yeah.
They sold newspapers, and this was a way to make money. But in talking to you about the idea of nicknames, I just wanted to mention one other thing. And I remember this when we did part one of our interview. I wanted to mention that I think Donald Trump, love him or hate him, Donald Trump is a master at nicknames. I mean, he uses the idea of nicknames to his advantage. I would love to like be able to ask him, where did he get this, I guess, political strategy, if you will, to really cast these disdain, if you will, nicknames like Crooked Hillary. I remember him saying, I think he said something to Michael Bloomberg, Little Mike, and it kind of reduces their credibility in many ways. Or Little Rubio, like Marco Rubio.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Lion Ted Cruz, right? And he just has a really, masterful way and unique way of reducing his political opponents, where I think it does have an effect.
Yeah.
So, like, again, going back to what you had said earlier, nicknames, you cannot undervalue the idea of the subject of nicknames is so valid and it's so important. And I think it goes over most people's head until someone like myself kind of like captures it and say, no, no, wait a minute. Let's really look at this. Let's really break it apart. Let's really analyze it because there's something underneath that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, he referred to the North Korean dictator as
Yes.
Rocket Man. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. 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 And everybody was like scared and shocked, but he ended up making, having a summit with them. But
Yes. Yeah.
think about Trump though. I think he's the first. I was thinking about that the other day. Franklin Roosevelt was from New York, and Teddy Roosevelt was from New York, but I don't think they were from New York City. I think Trump is the first president we've had who's
Yeah.
actually from the city. He grew up in
It's
Queens, of
originally
course.
from Queens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
you're
I'm
right.
thinking he's taken that idea, that using the nicknames to define a person rather than their regular name, and taking that and using it to his advantage in some way or another. And I think that's really a New York thing as well.
And I remember when the FBI director, when he met the President Trump at the time, James Comey, the very next day, the New York Post had "Me and the Don," right? And obviously the honorific title, the Italian version of, like Don Corleone, this and that. But no, they were making reference to Donald Trump, and obviously in a very clever way, using that honorific title of Don, right?
Yeah.
Don. I mean, again, it's clever. I think that for someone like myself, we really want to analyze it and break it apart and really appreciate the foundation of where this comes from.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the beauty of the subject of nicknames. I mean, we could go on and on. I truly, truly love the topic. And obviously that's why I wrote the book and hopefully some follow-up articles.
Yeah, well, that's great. Just thinking about Trump, you delve into the book about him and about his use of the term rat to
Yes.
define his lawyer who turned on him,
Yes.
and that was a big thing with regards to the mafia.
Yeah.
And you can explain that a little bit also to me. So,
Well, I mean, look, the term rat is obviously a very disparaging term. And when you think of a rat, it's a vermin, it's in the gutter. And, unfortunately, during the Holocaust, the Nazis used it as propaganda to kind of like equate the Jewish population as being the equivalent of rats. And that was abominable. It was just something that was unacceptable. But this is what the Nazi regime did. And so in the organized crime world, in the gangster, if you will, culture, being the rat is the lowest thing that you can be in the criminal underworld. And so I just thought it was interesting how he then, Donald Trump, uses that. And then it takes flight, right? And he's mentioning his former lawyer as being the rat. But what I also find interesting is that the same individuals who will bring up perhaps some type of situation, they're not called rats, they're called whistleblowers.
that's right. You're right. Right.
And there is a fine line.
Right.
There is a fine line between a rat and a whistleblower. However, it all is about perspective,
Right.
right? Whose perspective are we on? It's like the interpretation of the law, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, right? Whose interpretation is it? And I think that, that is what I found interesting in how the media it goes back to the media, how the media really covers this. And Donald Trump being from New York City, and obviously he has a way with nicknames. And I think that it makes sense for him to use that word, but then the media taking that to the next level, but not applying that same term to other individuals who also, you can argue, are rats.
Yeah, the traders or the truth tellers in a way. That's where
Exactly,
and
exactly.
so that's what he's looking at. Yeah, yeah,
I don't want to come off as being pro or con. That's not what I'm saying.
exactly
I
right. Sure.
just am analyzing this from a linguistic perspective. I'm not a linguist. However, I've done 20 years of research where I'm not even at that level, if you will, but I do think that I have more of an understanding than the average person. And so these are the questions that I ask. As I'm sure, and other linguists that I have interviewed also, they validate what I'm saying.
Well, that
How
was the big yeah, that was the big criticism of Trump was his linguistics because it wasn't what he said, but how he said it is what
Yes,
people got upset with him about. So I guess you're on the right track of that. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And I think it's just so important. Sometimes it's not what we hear, but it's how we say it, and then it becomes, oh, wait, maybe I need to stop for a second and just really listen to what this individual is saying.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ingenuity in it all. We kind of take it for granted the nickname that some person might acquire on the street, in the playground, or whatever it is. But
Yeah.
actually, when you delve into it, as you do in this book, there's a lot of ingenuity behind it all. It's quite creative in how people can define somebody by their moniker, and it really is uniquely Italian. It's fascinating.
Could I just say one other thing?
Go ahead.
The other thing that I want to mention is that the value of nicknames is interesting how it works itself in the courtroom.
Yeah.
Um, I just wanted to just make reference in the book, in chapter 6. So there was an individual by the name of Michael DiLeonardo, whose nickname was Mikey Scars, right? And in let's see, in 2006, he was a government witness. And he was a government witness and he testified against John Gotti Jr. This individual was caught up on the witness stand, and the prosecuting attorney, Michael J. McGovern, there was a Q&A part to this courtroom session where he asks the Mikey Scars DiLeonardo, he says, were you known by any nickname as you were growing up as a kid in Brooklyn? And I you could get this transcript on the internet. And so the response was, yes, I was. And he goes, what was the nickname? And he says that, well, Mikey Scars was my nickname. And then the prosecuting attorney says, well, how did you get that nickname, Mikey Scars? And he goes, well, when I was about 8 or 10 years old, I was bitten by a dog in the face and it left a visible scar. And so the prosecuting attorney says, well, how soon after the dog bite on your face did people start calling you Mikey Scars? And he said, well, almost immediately. And so at the age of 10, he responds, would you say 10 years old, more or less? And he said, yes. And have you ever used a nickname to refer to yourself? And he said, never. And my point is that this attorney, what he's trying to do is he's trying to influence the jury. And what he's trying to do is he's immediately attacking, because he knows that the opposition is going to say, oh, this guy, his name is Mikey Scars, and you can't trust what he says. So he's immediately trying to establish the narrative of how did he obtain this nickname, right? And in a very clever and masterful way, I think he succeeded. Now, what's interesting is back in 2010, so this is about 4 years later, Mikey Scars appears again. And one of the first things that the prosecutor mentions in the opening statement, or I'm sorry, the defense attorney says in his opening statement is, and the first, I quote, and the first government witness who's going to be here in a few minutes is a guy by the name of Mickey Scars. And he purposely omits his actual name. Why? Because again, he's trying to persuade the jury, if you will, to create this, Mikey Scars. Oh my God, he must have left scars on people,
Right.
very like pejorative kind of nickname that he was given. And so what's interesting is depending on which side you're on, you're going to use the nickname either to your advantage or disadvantage. It
Right.
really depends. And again, I can't stress enough the value and the meaning behind these nicknames.
Yeah, yeah. Scarface is, Mickey Scars is interesting because he took a name with Scars, and then you mentioned how Al Capone, Scarface. We made a movie called Scarface, but then you
Yep.
have Charlie Luciano. He had a huge scar on his face, but they called him Lucky because he survived. So the scar was used for whatever purpose. Yeah.
So that is interesting because my research has told me that, quite honestly, it wasn't because he survived an attack, but early on in his childhood, he was a gambler. And we're talking about 9, 10 years old, and he was really, really, really good at rolling the die and being lucky. And
How about that? Yeah.
that
Interesting.
supposedly is how he obtained the nickname of Lucky Luciano.
So it takes a nickname that he got as a kid, and then they adapt it, I guess, as they go along, whatever, to make his legend. To make the.
And oftentimes, a lot of these gangsters, they really receive the nickname early on, and then it just stays with them. It becomes more of their, it evolves and it becomes more of their identity.
Right, right, right. I mean, the future of nicknames. Do you think it's going to still continue as it is, or because of whatever the computer and whatever we have?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, we're talking about ancient Rome and ancient Greece. They use nicknames. So of course, this is inherently part of who we are as people. It's funny. I was looking at my bookshelf before we did the interview, and I want to also show your audience this book because what's interesting, and this has nothing to do with Italian American culture, but certainly a lot to do with the idea of nicknames. So apparently on the island of Bermuda, of all places, it is part of the culture in Bermuda to give those who were born or those who are residents of Bermuda a nickname. Who knew? And this is written by Ras Mikal, who wrote the book Nicknames, How You Got Your Nickname. It's a novelty book about how people in Bermuda got their nicknames. Right?
Yeah.
So again, I do believe nicknames follows the Italian American community, but I also think that we cannot negate the fact that nicknames is throughout the beginning of time. It crosses over all cultures, and that's the beauty that I hope people really understand and get, not only with my book, but books like this with nicknames. I mean, it's just, please delve into it because I think, especially the world right now is so upside down. There's so many things going on. Books like this are just a nice way to escape
Right.
everyday pressures of what we want to, what we have to really confront sometimes.
Right, right. Well, tell folks where they can pick up your book. I'll put links down
Oh,
also. But
yes, Amazon. There's good reviews on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the big companies. It's American Society of Geolinguistics is the publisher. Lulu Press is the printer, which is they're based in North Carolina. And again, it's been great, even though it was now 2021. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's still relevant to what's going on with the Tommy DeVito situation, Tommy Cutlets, and all the American journalism taking on the mob lingo, if you will, to a lot of references that are made on TV and in politics. All across the board, we have the elements of Italian American culture in language.
it's a fascinating topic, and it's so good that you've put that in this book that we can all read and enjoy and get a better understanding of our culture and background, how it's related to the phenomenon of nicknames. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
well, thank you very much for being with me today, and folks, it's a great book. Yeah, it's a wonderful book, folks. Again, from Fra Angelico to Frankie One Eye, and it really covers the whole basis of
And
monikers.
stay tuned
nicknames.
for the Yogi Berra in spring, Primo magazine. This is the
That's right. We'll
Yogi-
have an article on Yogi Berra come spring, perfect for baseball, and
He's
we'll have
become
probably more stuff from Al as well.
he's become my new interest, Yogi Berra.
And you might do an article for us on Delmonico, the steakhouse that's there.
Yes,
So that's gonna be
I
good.
am doing it. Yes, yes.
And that'll be a good time for you to enjoy a good steak there, I'm sure.
Yes, I plan on doing that with some family. We plan on going, and you know, unfortunately, they were closed during the pandemic, but now
Yes.
opened. So it's going to be fun.
Well, that's true about yourself. I mean, you're a proud Italian American, but you're also a very proud New Yorker. You enjoy the city very much. You teach there, and you do so much there. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, indeed.
Well, great. Happy New Year, Al, and all the best. We'll definitely have you again. Again, we'll do more stuff with you. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Happy New Year to you and your family as well.
Thank you very much. Okay.